My friends, tonight is gonna be all about weathering with oil paints. Well, almost, because we also need to paint the stowage on this model. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, this is a T-55 from Tamiya in 1/48 scale, which I built as a Syrian tank. And last week I painted it using the hairspray chipping method as well as some post shading with the new ammo shaders. To put it simply, it's a pretty nice canvas for oil paint weathering, so let's get right into it, shall we? We'll be working with 502 Abteilung oil paints, which are just excellent, but they need some preparation. To ensure they'll dry completely flat, we need to drain the linseed oil on a piece of cardboard. I usually leave them like this overnight, but in this example I started working with them after 5 hours. This process also makes them dry much faster, but we'll get into that. Starting with a pin wash, I'm mixing the paint directly on the cardboard palette because it's more practical. Now, it's understandable that you should be familiar with pin washes if you decide to go this route, especially their ideal consistency. That's why enamel washes are much easier to use. You just shake the bottle and the paint is ready to go. But if you're already familiar with this technique, oil paints actually give you way more options. You see, when you're blending or removing the excess enamel wash, it's sort of all or nothing. So you either wipe it off completely or you'll end up with a stain on your model. This isn't a bad thing at all, it makes the pin wash look super sharp, but oil paints, they just blend more smoothly, and it's also easier to create fake shadows or streaking effects or just random dirt and grime stains using the process. I also find them flowing a bit smoother compared to enamels. In many cases I just had to slightly touch a certain detail with my paintbrush and the paint would flow all around it, whilst with enamels I'd have to apply the wash in multiple steps from different angles. I already talked about these differences several months ago in one of my Yak Tiger videos, but I think it's extra worth mentioning on this model, because first of all, sepia is a really nice paint. It hits that sweet spot between brown and black, making it perfect for a very dark pin wash and also oil stains. This model is pretty grimy already, thanks to the post shading, so the oil paint will nicely emphasize that. Another reason for this dark pin wash is when you want to make a very dusty model in the end. Earth effects, especially dust and rain marks, they sort of tend to, dull down most of the contrast, so a dark pin wash will sort of balance things out, if that makes any sense. Last thing I wanted to mention is drying time. If you leave oils on the cardboard palette for very long, let's say overnight, they'll in fact dry faster than enamels. Which is awesome, right? But this also means you should always work in small sections and blend them rather swiftly. It's really easy to get carried away and suddenly, 30 minutes will pass and you'll find yourself scrubbing the model with a stiff paintbrush, trying to blend a dried up oil paint stain. So yeah, it's worth keeping in mind. Personally, I'm becoming an oil paint fanboy because working with them feels more, I don't know how to put it, it feels more creative. You can play around with different intensities, add heavier or lighter layers. It sort of makes you feel like an artist. Before we move on to rust-colored oil paints, we need to prepare a few details using grey, brown and silver acrylics. And instead of using a cardboard palette, which from now on I'm gonna call dry palette, acrylics are most pleasant to work with on a wet palette. So, the DHK machine gun was base coated with dark grey. There's nothing special about it, it's just a good base coat for dark steel finishes. We can use different greys on spare tracks, thus giving them more contrast. This works perfectly when you have a longer section where you can vary each link, but obviously it works in any situation, even when you have just two. Dark rust from Vallejo is a fantastic chipping color, and although we have chipped the model completely with the hairspray method, we can use it to emphasize some worn edges, for example. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, the rebar cage received a base coat of dark rust, but that's just a base coat. I mixed some light bluish grey and applied it in random shapes and amounts over the whole thing. Let's call it a heavy wash and chipping at the same time. This kind of surface, when you combine it with rust-colored oil paints, will end up in a much more realistic looking finish. It's also very easy yet extremely effective on any type of raw steel surface. The cage was welded to the tank in the field, so naturally it's not the prettiest thing ever. Welding in this manner means the paint has to be removed, otherwise there will be no welding, and also the process itself causes a lot of damage to the surrounding paint job. This is easily replicated with chipping using the dark rust color, and also a thin outline with the new AK 3rd generation silver acrylic paint for the actual weld bead. Now that I mentioned weld beads, reference pictures show they're all worn down on these tanks. It makes sense after all. I mean, look at all the chipping around them. And as we already know on this channel, welds on armor don't rust, so they'll remain nice and shiny even decades after the tank was left to rot in the middle of desert or whatever. This is one of the reasons why sculpting your own welds or retexturing the existing ones in the kit, it sort of pays off in the long run. Alright, onto the actual rust effects. It's one of the easiest techniques out there, because the acrylic undercoat does most of the heavy lifting for you. If you have a combination of a dark rust and some light bluish gray, all you need is just a heavy wash of dark and light rust. It doesn't matter if you're using enamels or oils. However, I found a small difference there. Oil paints tend to leave a more uniform and opaque finish, so they're really efficient for these heavily corroded surfaces. Here it's super important to drain them on a dry palette, because nothing can ruin your day more than glossy rust. We can also create additional contrast using lighter rust. In this case I used dark rust and oxide patina, using the latter as a sort of accent color, distinguishing details from one another. Just as expected, they dry completely flat and the result doesn't look bad, at all. Nothing is perfect in real life though, and soon I found a very big problem. Well, okay, this might be completely subjective, but it seems to me that oil paints are not very suitable for subtle rust stains around chipping effects. Because no matter what I tried, I wasn't able to make them work to my liking, even if my life would depend on it. It's hard to describe, but just like I mentioned on the rebar cage, they were leaving this opaque, sort of film over the whole surface, which is quite the opposite to what enamels do. When I'm blending enamel rust tones, they leave a very faint, super subtle trace of rust that looks just perfect, and you can cover the whole model with them and it won't look like a rusted out brick, at all. I don't know, but I decided to push on. No bailing on this one, my friends. And the sour taste quickly went away as soon as I started blending them on more rusted out surfaces. Here I'm working with light rust and oxide patina, and the result is much better compared to enamels. So I think the takeaway from this experiment is that each tool has its place. We just have to know when to use it. In this case, at least for me, it'll be enamel rust for small chipping effects and oil paints for larger, rusted out surfaces. And because we painted this model with a combination of hairspray chipping and post shading, a pin wash and a few rust tones is all it needed. The tank's surface is now ready for rubble, debris and dust, but we still need to paint the stowage and some details. Here I'm also gonna employ a slightly different approach than before, which will make the process more straightforward. We'll need only 3 paints, but most of the work will be done with 2 lighter ones. The process was suggested to me by Mark, one of my patrons who's also a miniature painter, and it goes something like this. Well, okay, the more traditional way of doing this is by starting with a base color, right? Which is somewhere in the middle, a mid-tone so to say. And then you add several layers of shadows, followed up by multiple highlights. But this slightly different method starts with the darkest color, so we're actually base coating the entire part with a shadow, and then we're just gonna light it up more and more. So in the case of this dust cover, I knew I wanted an overall light tan color, and US Fill Trap seems like a good shadow for that. Then I just kept making it lighter and lighter with light mud until the last highlight where I used the latter color on its own. Technically the first few layers should be rather generous because we need to establish the mid-tone first, so we also need to paint over some of those shadowed parts, otherwise the contrast would be unnaturally strong. It also needs you to have at least a vague idea about the finished result, otherwise you can easily choose the wrong colors. A better and easier to follow example for this method would be using Russian uniform or German field grey as the base coat, because these are naturally pretty dark, and then just lightening them up with Iraqi sand. The finished detail doesn't look bad at all, but yeah, it's very clean at this stage, but don't worry, we'll add some stains to it in a moment. But first, there's other details that need our attention. All lights and periscopes were painted with dark grey. It's a very easy hack, but luckily most lights on a T-55 are just like this, especially the night vision lamp. The wooden crate is another example of this approach. I used field grey as a base color, and because the details on this part are rather soft, I mean, it's a 3D printed model which I scaled down, so the individual panel lines are very shallow. I outlined them with German camouflage black-brown. We don't need to be very neat, because it's easy to fix any mistakes with the base color. Then I added Iraqi sand and mixed a lighter version, which makes the box look more three-dimensional by adding fake depth, but also, if we apply it in numerous thin brush strokes, we can simulate some fake wood grain texture. The final layer is deck tan around the edges, which represents chipped paint and the natural wood color showing through. Nothing overly complicated, and it can be done all with acrylics. Modern vehicles give us an opportunity for some colorful civilian stowage. This metal box, I don't even know what it is, but it's just another 3D printed accessory. It will add a ton of contrast and texture to our model. Working with vivid colors like these can be intimidating, because we need to tone them down and thus bring more balance to our model. But it's actually not so difficult. All they need are a few basic weathering techniques such as a pin wash, some chipping around the edges, and of course rust effects. We can go much heavier on these because civilian stuff might spend several years outside and become very rusty, which makes it very easy to appreciate by us modelers. I did the same thing on the 3D printed jerry can, just a pin wash, chipping and rust effects. Similar effects can be done on tarps and other soft details. Some can be integrated with the model using dust effects, which we'll do in the next episode, or with dark, grimy stains. It depends on the surroundings. In this case, the gun barrel is very grimy, so it's only natural to put some of that on the dust shroud as well. We should, however, avoid pin washing the tarp, because the paint would collect into faults and that wouldn't look very authentic. The final detail was putting 2 layers of AK wet effects on every headlight and periscope, giving them a nice glossy look. Most of the model is now ready for dust and rubble, but we haven't even touched the running gear so far. I glued it into 2 sub-assemblies. My usual approach is to keep the tracks and wheels separate and removable for painting and weathering, but this seemed to be more efficient to me. Well, let's see how efficient it actually is. So, there's obviously a lot of overspray from wheels, but this is an easy fix with a few passes of acrylic dark rust from Life Color. Contact points are usually polished and shiny on functional vehicles, but reference photos often show the exact opposite on tanks operating in the desert. For whatever reason, tracks in the sand remain mostly corroded. But I wanted to try something unusual. As you already figured out, the shiny surface was achieved with silver acrylic paint from AK. Then I gave these sections a heavy wash mixed from dark rust, completely covering it up. And just like on the spare tracks, oxide patina was painted on the edge of each link as a sort of highlight or outline. All of this was blended with enamel thinner, exposing some of the shiny surface. My camera didn't want to focus on the track for whatever reason, but I hope it's clear enough to at least give you a vague idea. And finally, the rubber parts were picked out with dark gray. This step needed more precision than usual, but it wasn't as bad as I expected. Both running gear assemblies are now painted in their appropriate colors and ready to be weathered with dust and some grime stains, which is exactly what we'll do in the next video. Yep, the model still isn't finished. I know, and if you're wondering what's taking me so long, well, it's all the details like tarps, sandbags, bricks, more tarps, wooden crates. To put things into perspective, one tarp can take about 45 minutes to paint. The dust shroud on the gun mantlet, for example, took more than an hour, so yeah, it takes some time. But on the other hand, I find painting stowage super relaxing. Which is quite funny if we look 1 year back when I was all like, oh, stowage phobia, please don't ask me to paint tarps. But yeah, if you put some practice into the technique, you'll actually find it quite enjoyable. Especially when you can play around with different colors or different highlighting mixtures and so on. So in the next video we'll cover this tank with rubble, pieces of bricks, lots of dust, and some other interesting effects. That should also tie all these different colors together, making the overall look of the model more subdued. But that's a story for another Friday, so in the meantime I just want to say thank you for watching, and a special shout out goes to my amazing patrons who make this weekly show possible. If you like what you saw, you can leave me a like, dislike if you didn't like it, and if you liked it a lot, you'll find more of this stuff on my Patreon page. There's almost daily updates from all my projects, and by now there's altogether several thousands of pictures. There's DMs, there's 1 week early ad-free videos so you could watch the finished model right now, and also 3D details made by yours truly, which comes in pretty handy if you have a printer yourself, and also some real-life reference pictures for good measure. Anyway, this model will have a scenic base and I'm trying to design some interesting building for it. In other words, I'm just gonna go now so I can finish the weathering, so we can again carve some styrofoam and do other exciting diorama things, alright? Oh, and of course, stay safe, stay awesome, build models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!